The sun, typically a harbinger of peaceful mornings in the planned community of Willow Creek, felt judgmental, its light harsh on the meticulously maintained lawns. Liam, a man whose patience was as worn as the granite countertops in his kitchen, stood by the edge of his property, his jaw tight. For years, he had lived in an uneasy truce with the Homeowners Association, or rather, with its self-appointed monarch, a woman known universally, and often venomously, as Karen. Willow Creek was bisected by a modest, natural creek, more a large, meandering stream, really that had been the primary reason Liam purchased the plot. It was a haven, a soft, gurgling counterpoint to the relentless perfection demanded by the HOA. The creek fed into a slightly larger body of water a mile down the road, and its banks, lined with native willows and rushes, were a small patch of glorious, unmanaged chaos in a sea of prescribed order. This creek, however, was Karen's latest obsession. She deemed it a liability, a messy hydrological inconvenience, and, most damningly in her eyes, not aesthetically aligned with the community's vision. Liam had received the usual barrage of passive-aggressive HOA notices, each one stapled to official letterhead that seemed to weep sanctimony. Initially, they were polite suggestions: please consider manicuring the riparian zone. Then, they escalated: immediate remediation of the unapproved water feature is required. Liam had responded with factual documentation. The creek was a protected, natural waterway, not an unapproved water feature, and he had the state permits to prove it. Karen, however, did not deal in facts, she dealt in fiat. She was a fixture at every HOA meeting, her voice a grating, high-pitched whine as she leveraged her position on the Architectural Review Board to micromanage the lives of every resident. She could cite, verbatim, the clause on approved mailbox colors, but remained blissfully, sometimes willfully, ignorant of actual environmental law. Her power was derived from the apathy of her neighbors, most of whom paid their dues, ignored her memos, and prayed she wouldn't target them next. The situation came to a head on a Tuesday. Liam was in his home office, listening to the soothing sounds of the creek outside, when the noise began, a harsh, rhythmic clanking followed by the deep, grumbling idle of heavy machinery. Alarmed, he strode out the back door and stopped dead on his flagstone patio. What he saw was a tableau of absolute, staggering audacity. On the creek bank, barely 10 feet from his property line, sat a commercial cement mixer truck, its massive drum slowly revolving. Next to it, gesturing wildly with a clipboard, was Karen, dressed in a pristine white polo shirt and khaki shorts, her face a mask of smug satisfaction. Two burly, indifferent-looking contractors were already unloading thick, viscous gray slurry directly into the creek bed. The natural flow of the water, gentle just minutes before, was being violently arrested by a rapidly growing, unnatural barrier. "What in God's name are you doing?" Liam's voice was low, dangerous, cutting through the mechanical noise. Karen turned slowly, a smirk curling her lips. She didn't have the decency to look surprised. She looked triumphant. "Mr. Davies," she began, using his formal name with cold disdain, "I am executing a necessary aesthetic and safety modification. Section 4.3.c of the revised covenants, conditions, and restrictions allows for the elimination of unmanaged water features that pose a potential liability to adjacent properties. The creek is being cemented, Karen." Liam interrupted, stepping down onto the grass, the soft earth yielding slightly under his weight. "That is an environmental crime. That is a protected waterway. You don't have the permits for this." Karen waved her hand dismissively, an infuriating little flick of the wrist. "The HOA has voted, unanimously, I might add, to mitigate this hazard. We are simply creating a dry, low-maintenance culvert to handle storm runoff. This will improve property values. She pointed to the emerging gray dam with the pride of an architect unveiling a masterpiece. The cement was already hardening at the edges, turning the clear water into a turbid mess of gray sludge, effectively creating an immediate, solid blockage. Liam felt a visceral wave of fury mixed with a sickening sense of powerlessness. He knew, instantaneously, that this wasn't about property values or safety, it was about control, about proving that her will was the only law that mattered in Willow Creek. She wanted to erase the one wild, untamable thing on Liam's land. You are breaking federal and state law. I have the documentation. I will call the EPA. He yelled. Karen chuckled, a brittle, unpleasant sound. Feel free, Mr. Davies. By the time they send anyone out, the work will be complete and paid for by the HOA Special Assessment Fund. She signaled to the contractors, who, with renewed vigor, began directing the cement mixer chute to fill the entire width of the stream bed. It was an act of brutal, ecological vandalism, performed in broad daylight, sanctioned by a woman whose sole credential was her sheer, unyielding self-importance. As the last of the creamy, heavy gray material spilled into the creek, obliterating the sound of running water with the ominous silence of stone in the making, Liam realized his only immediate recourse wasn't to argue with Karen, who was now preening at her success, but to document her transgression. He pulled out his phone, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the cold rage that was beginning to crystallize into a plan. The sun beat down, making the setting cement steam faintly. The creek was gone, replaced by a thick, ugly gray scar, a physical manifestation of Karen's concrete ultimatum. The silence of the formerly flowing water was deafening, but it was a silence that Liam knew would soon be replaced by the sound of something much, much louder. The immediate aftermath of Karen's concrete assault on the creek was a surreal silence, a void where the gentle burble of moving water had been. Liam stood on the bank, the scent of fresh cement acrid in the humid air, watching the gray mass cure. It was a dam, crude and unforgiving, spanning the full 20-foot width of the creek bed. He had called the authorities, the county environmental agency, the local police, and even a lawyer specializing in property rights and HOA disputes. The responses, however, were predictable and infuriatingly slow. The police deemed it a civil matter. The environmental agency promised an inspector would visit sometime next week. The lawyer spoke of injunctions and long, expensive battles. All of it was too slow for the water. Water, unlike bureaucracy, obeyed only the laws of physics. Karen, meanwhile, was basking in her victory. She had departed with the cement truck, leaving behind the two contractors, who were now casually packing up their tools, their faces devoid of emotion, their professional detachment shielding them from the moral implications of what they had just executed. As they drove away, Karen's black SUV passed Liam's house, and she offered a triumphant, saccharine wave that made his blood boil. She had solved her liability, and in her mind, the matter was closed. But water always finds a way. The creek, now abruptly blocked, was already pooling. Over the last hour, the volume had noticeably increased. The banks of the stream, usually dry and firm, were becoming saturated. The water, unable to push through the concrete barrier, was spreading laterally, creeping up the sloping ground of Liam's yard. Liam checked the weather forecast again. A significant band of rain was predicted for the next evening, a standard late summer storm that, under normal circumstances, the creek would handle with ease, its banks channeling the increased flow downstream. Now, the concrete blockade had transformed a benign stream into a pressure vessel. The water behind the dam was rising steadily, turning the natural course into a small, brown-tinged pond. Liam's property, situated slightly higher than Karen's, was the first area to see the water rise dramatically. He could manage his yard, he had sandbags ready and his foundation was secure. But the fundamental law of water flow dictated that the level would rise until it found the next path of least resistance. And that path, he realized with a slow, creeping grin of vindication, was directly toward Karen's house. Karen's property, a sprawling, overly ornate McMansion, was situated downstream and slightly lower than the rest of the neighborhood, a design flaw that had always been a minor source of local gossip. Her yard sloped gently down toward the now blocked creek course, but the key element was her massive, finished basement. She had boasted endlessly about the home theater and wine cellar nestled 2 stories beneath her first floor. Because her property was at a lower elevation, the concrete dam had not only stopped the water flow but had raised the water table in the immediate vicinity, directing the now stagnant, pooling water to find a new equilibrium. As the afternoon wore on, the creek water, which was pooling deeper and wider, began to bypass the concrete dam entirely. It didn't wash over the dam, instead, the sheer volume and pressure forced the water to seek out the natural depressions and drainage routes in the surrounding soil. The water, following the original slope toward the now dry creek bed, began to saturate the ground surrounding Karen's foundation. Liam walked to the border of their properties, a line marked by an absurdly perfect hedge Karen insisted upon. He could see small, dark patches appearing on her manicured lawn near the side of her house. These weren't puddles from the morning dew, they were areas where the ground was becoming utterly saturated, unable to absorb the constant pressure from the backing water. He could practically hear the earth sucking in the moisture. The real show, however, began with the approaching rainstorm. As twilight approached, the sky turned a bruised, angry purple. The first heavy drops of rain hit the pooling water, causing ripples that quickly turned into the churn of a true deluge. The creek, deprived of its natural escape, swelled exponentially. The pond behind the dam grew from a few feet deep to several, the water pushing against the banks with tremendous force. The water, finding the path of least resistance, began to infiltrate the soil near the lowest point of the new, massive water body, which just happened to be near Karen's foundation walls. Basements are inherently susceptible to hydrostatic pressure, especially when the surrounding soil is completely saturated. Liam didn't need a degree in fluid dynamics to understand what was happening, he just needed common sense. The ground around Karen's foundation was becoming a saturated sponge, and the water was now exerting immense pressure on the weakest points of her basement structure, hairline cracks in the concrete, poorly sealed pipe penetrations, and the seam between the slab and the walls. The dry, low-maintenance culvert Karen had created was acting as a massive, unintended rainwater harvesting system, and the tank for the system was the subsurface soil surrounding her house. From his vantage point, Liam saw no immediate signs of surface flooding on Karen's lawn. The main drama was happening underground, unseen and inescapable. He imagined the slow, relentless capillary action, the water seeping through the smallest imperfections, turning the dry, carefully controlled environment of her finished basement into a slow-motion disaster zone. The water wasn't coming from the sky, it was coming from the ground, pushed by the force of the dam she had foolishly erected. It was an elegant, unintended consequence, a perfect example of nature's brutal justice. She had intended to make his life messy by blocking the flow. Instead, she had simply diverted that mess, amplified by the rain, and delivered it straight into the heart of her own immaculate domain. The concrete ultimatum was now an unintended flood control feature, and the person being controlled was its creator. Liam finally retreated inside, the satisfaction of impending doom warming him as the heavy rain hammered against his windows, each drop a tiny hammer blow against the foundation of Karen's hubris. The night that followed the deluge was punctuated by the kind of silence that precedes true catastrophe, the quiet of hydrostatic pressure building against fragile structures. Liam did not sleep well, but his restlessness was tinged with an almost giddy anticipation. He knew, with the certainty of gravity, that the water had nowhere to go but down, and for Karen's house, down meant the meticulously installed oak floor and plush furnishings of her finished basement. He rose before the sun, grabbing a thermos of coffee and his phone, eager to survey the scene. The rain had ceased, leaving the air heavy and cool. The first thing he noticed as he stepped onto his patio was the pervasive damp smell, not of normal rain, but of freshly disturbed, saturated earth. Walking toward the property line, Liam found the creek course still blocked by the massive gray concrete slab, which was now fully cured and looked grotesquely permanent. The pool of water behind it had stabilized, but the banks were muddy and deeply compromised. The diversion, however, was complete. The ground surrounding the perimeter of Karen's house was visibly waterlogged, her perfectly manicured lawn squelching audibly under Liam's feet as he edged closer to her boundary line. He could see that the lower half of her foundation, where it met the soil, was dark with moisture, a clear indication that the capillary action had worked its way up the concrete. The only signs of life were the HOA-approved plastic flamingos, now standing forlornly in ankle-deep sludge. Suddenly, a sound broke the stillness, a muffled, high-pitched shriek followed by the rhythmic, sputtering noise of a pump. Liam moved to a position where he could clearly see Karen's back door. It was flung open, and a hose, thick and black, snaked out across her deck, spewing a continuous stream of brown, muddy water onto the already saturated lawn. Karen herself emerged, her pristine white polo shirt replaced by a soggy, stained dressing gown, her usually immaculate hair pulled into a frantic, chaotic knot. Her face was pale, blotchy with exhaustion and sheer terror. She was yelling into a phone, her voice strained and cracking, the typical haughty tone replaced by raw panic. "No. You don't understand. It's not just a leak. It's rising. I think my whole basement floor is moving." Liam didn't need to see the basement to understand the mechanics of the disaster. The water, unable to follow its natural course, had saturated the earth around her foundation. The hydrostatic pressure, the sheer weight of the groundwater, had found every weak point, seeping not just through cracks but potentially compromising the seals around her utility pipes. The pump was a desperate, futile attempt to empty a tank that was being refilled by the entire accumulated volume of the blocked creek and the storm runoff. He imagined the scene downstairs, the custom home theater carpet soaked, the drywall wicking moisture halfway up the walls, and the wine cellar, designed for climate control, now transformed into a dank, mud-colored pool, the involuntary fish tank. As Karen struggled with the heavy pump hose, dragging it to a different spot on the deck, a large, official-looking black truck pulled up abruptly in her driveway. Two men in uniforms bearing the logo of the County Environmental and Water Quality Enforcement stepped out, clipboards in hand. This was the moment Liam had been waiting for. He quickly crossed the lawn, greeting the officials before Karen could intercept them. "Good morning, gentlemen," Liam said, gesturing toward the massive concrete plug in the creek. "I called you yesterday. I believe you're here about the unpermitted, illegal damming of a natural waterway, which has now caused significant, localized flooding and environmental damage." The lead inspector, a serious-looking man named Agent Miller, took one look at the concrete dam and his face hardened. This is a gross violation, sir. A clear obstruction. Did you do this? He asked Liam. No, sir, Liam replied, turning just as Karen rushed up, frantic and breathless. She did, he finished, pointing directly at her. As the self-appointed representative of the Willow Creek HOA, she hired contractors and ordered them to pour cement into a state-protected creek bed. Karen immediately launched into a sputtering denial, a torrent of excuses about liability, community standards, and unanimous votes. Agent Miller simply held up a hand, silencing her instantly. Ma'am, an HOA cannot supersede environmental protection laws. This creek is mapped and protected. An unauthorized structure like this carries substantial fines and a mandatory removal order, which will be executed immediately, at the owner's expense. The legal currents were swift and unforgiving. Agent Miller spent the next 2 hours documenting the violation, taking extensive photographs of the dam and the massive, muddy pool it had created. He also, crucially, took note of the extensive flooding around Karen's house. He explained to her that the removal of the cement would be extremely costly and would require specialized heavy equipment to break up and extract the hardened concrete without causing further ecological damage. The fine alone, he noted dryly, would likely dwarf her entire HOA budget for the next 3 years. As the inspectors concluded their work, a third vehicle arrived, a sleek sedan carrying the HOA's actual legal counsel, summoned by a panicked board member who had finally understood the gravity of Karen's actions. The lawyer, a harried-looking woman, took one look at the cement dam and the water-damaged basement window wells, and her shoulders slumped. She informed Karen, in clear, concise legal terms, that not only was the HOA liable for the environmental fines, but Karen herself was personally exposed to immense civil liability from Liam and, more acutely, from the HOA board for gross misuse of funds and liability exposure. Liam watched the spectacle unfold from his patio, sipping his now cool coffee. The triumph was profound, but quiet. Karen was not just facing fines, she was facing the complete, public dismantling of the power base she had so ruthlessly cultivated. She had traded the manageable flow of a natural creek for a catastrophic, messy, and financially ruinous flood in her own home. The water she had so desperately tried to control had turned on her, delivering a justice that was perfectly proportional to her act of concrete spite. The cement blockade, her symbol of ultimate control, had become the catalyst for her spectacular downfall, forcing her to confront the reality that nature, and law, always triumph over petty tyranny.